is surprising how the seeds get after a while. I've got a lot of pruning.
Welcome, a beautiful morning. Shabbat morning. Philippines, I should say. 2:5. Have this attitude in yourselves, which also was in Messiah Yeshua, who though existing in the form of Elohim, did not consider being equal to Elohim, a thing to be grasped, but he emptied himself, taking on the form of a slave, becoming the likeness of men, and being found in the appearance as a man. He humbled himself, becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on the cross. For this reason, Elohim exalted him and gave him the name, and is above every name. Thus, at the name of Yeshua, every knee should bow, in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue confess that Yeshua, Messiah, is Adonai, is Lord, to the glory of Elohim, the Father Abba. Let's rise together. Shema Israel, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad, Baruch Shem Kevod, Malchuto, Le'olam Va'ed. Hear Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Blessed is his name and his glorious kingdom for all eternity. And you shall love Adonai your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength. And these words which I am commanding you today are to be on your heart. And you are to teach them diligently to your children, and to speak of them when you sit in your house, and when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise up. Bind them as a sign on your hand, and they are to be a frontlet between your eyes, and write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. And you shall love your neighbor as yourself. The entire Torah and the prophets hang on these two commandments.
He's our rock. Whatever kind of week you've had this week, He will never let you down. He'll never leave you. He is always faithful.
Oh, yeah. Yes, God. Oh. We have a new sound guy. That's awesome. Yeah. We'll be into it soon. Right. So, Exodus 21, ordinances for the covenant. Now these are the ordinances which you will set before them. If you buy a Hebrew servant, he is to serve for 6 years, and in the 7th he is to go free, without payment. If he comes in by himself, he is to go out by himself. If he was married, then his wife will go out with him. If his master gave him a wife, and she bears him sons or daughters, the wife and her children will be her master's, and he will go free by himself. But if the servant plainly states, I love my master, my wife, my children, and I will not go out free, then his master is to bring him to God. Then take him to a door or doorpost. His master is to pierce his ear through with an awl, and he will serve him forever. If a man sells his daughter to be a maidservant, she is not to go free as the male servants do. If she does not please her master, who has selected her for himself, then he is to allow her to be redeemed. He will have no power to sell her to foreign people, seeing as he has dealt deceitfully toward her. If he betrays her to his son, he must give her the rights of a daughter. If he takes another wife, he is not to diminish her food, her clothing, or her marriage rights. If he does not provide these three to her, then she is to go free without payment. Whoever strikes a man so that he dies must surely be put to death. But if he did not hunt him down, yet God caused it to happen, then I will appoint for you a place where you may run. If a man presumes to kill his neighbour with craftiness, You are to take him from my altar and put him to death. Anyone who strikes his father or his mother surely be put to death. Anyone who steals a person and sells them or is found with him under his hand must surely be put to death. Whoever curses his father or his mother, whoever curses his father or mother must surely be put to death. If people quarrel and one strikes the other with a stone or with his fist, and the other does not die but lies in bed, if he raises again and walks around on a staff, then the one that struck him will be cleared, but he must pay for the loss of his time and help him to be thoroughly healed.
If a man strikes his male or female servant with a staff, who dies by his hand, he must surely be punished. Notwithstanding, if the servant gets up in a day or two, he will not be punished, for he is his property. If men fight and hit a pregnant woman so that her child is born early, yet no harm follows, the one who hit her is to be strictly fined, according to what the woman's husband demands of him. He must pay as the judges determine. But if any harm follows, then you are to penalise life for life, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, hand for a hand, foot for a foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, blow for blow. If a man strikes the eye of his male or female slave and destroys it, he must let him go free for the sake of his eyesight. If he strikes out his slave's tooth, he must let him go free for the sake of his tooth. If an ox gores a man or a woman so that they die, the ox must surely be stoned, and its meat is not to be eaten, but the owner of the ox will be cleared. If the ox was given to goring in times past, and a warning has been given to its owner, yet it has not kept it pent up, and it has killed a man or woman, then the ox must be stoned, and its owner must also be put to death. If instead a ransom is placed on him, then he is to pay for the redemption of his life whatever is demanded. Whether it has gored a son or daughter, this rule is to be applied to him. If the ox gores a male or female slave, he is to pay 30 shekels of silver to their own master, and the ox is to be stoned. If one uncovers a pit or digs a pit and does not cover it, and an ox or a donkey falls in, the owner of the pit must pay compensation. He is to give money to the owner, and the dead animal will be his. If one man's ox hurts another's ox so that it dies, they are to sell the live ox and divide the price. They are also to divide the dead one. Or if it becomes known that the ox was given to violence in times past, and its owner has not kept it pent up, he must surely pay ox for ox, and the dead animal will be his own. If a man steals an ox or a sheep and kills it or sells it, he is to pay 5 oxen for 1 ox, or 4 sheep for 1 sheep. Hope that was helpful.
Don't you just love the wisdom of God? It's awesome. If a thief found breaking in is struck so that he dies, there is no blood guilt for him. But if the sun has risen, there is blood guilt, and he is to make full restitution. If he has nothing, then he must be sold for his theft. If the item is found in his hand alive, whether ox, donkey, or sheep, he is to pay double. That sounds fair. If a man causes a field or vineyard to be eaten by letting his animal loose, and it feeds in another man's field, then he is to make restitution from the best of his own field and the best of his vineyard. Oh, that sounds good. If fire breaks out and spreads among thorns, so that stalks of grain, standing grain for the fields themselves are consumed, then the one who lit the fire must make full restitution. It makes people think, hey, when you have consequences like this, if a man entrusts his neighbor with money or items of safekeeping, and it is stolen out of the man's house, when the thief is found, he must pay double. If the thief is not found, then the master of the house is to present himself to God, to see whether he has laid his hand on his neighbor's goods. For any transgression, whether ox, donkey, sheep, clothing, or anything else lost, when someone says, "This is mine," the case of both parties is to be brought before God. The one whom God convicts is to pay double to his neighbor. If a man entrusts his neighbor with a donkey, ox, sheep, or any animal to care for, and it dies, is hurt or taken away with no one seen, then there must be an oath before Adonai between the two of them to determine whether or not he has laid his hand on his neighbor's goods. The owner is to accept it with no restitution. But if indeed it was stolen from him, he is to make restitution to the owner. If it is torn in pieces, let him bring it as evidence. He is not required to pay for what has been torn to pieces. If a man borrows anything belonging to his neighbor, and it is harmed or dies in the absence of the owner, he must make full restitution. But if the owner is present, he is not required to pay restitution. If it is rented, it is covered by the rental fee. If a man seduces a virgin who is not engaged and lies with her, he must pay dowry for her to be his wife. But if her father utterly refuses to give her to him, he must weigh out silver equal to the dowry for virgins. You must not permit a sorceress to live. Anyone who lies with an animal must surely be put to death. Anyone who sacrifices to the gods, except to Adonai alone, is to be put under a ban of destruction. You must not exploit or oppress an outsider, for you were outsiders in the land of Egypt. You must not mistreat any widow or orphan. If you mistreat them in any way, and they cry out to me, I will surely hear their cry. My wrath will burn hot, and I will kill you with the sword. So your wives will become widows, and your children will become orphans. If you lend money, see, God's dealing a lot with the intent, isn't he? With our intent of heart often. He's really balanced. If you lend money to any of my people, to the poor among you, you are not to act like a debt collector with him, and you are not to charge him interest. If you ever take your neighbor's cloak as a pledge, you are to return it to him before the sun goes down. For that is his only covering, his cloak for his skin. What will he sleep in? When he cries out to me, I will hear, because I am gracious. You would think, over a cloak, but yep, God's interested in the details. Do not despise God, or cause a ruler of your people. So is that? Do not despise God. Or curse, sorry. Thank you. Do not hold back the fullness of your crops or your vintage. You are to present the firstborn of your sons to me. Do the same with your cattle and with your sheep. For 7 days it is to be with its mother, and on the 8th day you are to give it to me. You are to be a holy people for me. You must not eat any flesh torn by beasts in the field. You may throw it out to the dogs. See, we often regard a lot of this, as God's just restricting us, but he's not. He's wanting us to be blessed. That's why he's giving us all these great commands. Amen.
So reading on in Exodus 23. Do not spread a false report. Do not join hands with the wicked by becoming a malicious witness. Do not follow a crowd to do evil. Nor are you to testify in a case, to follow a crowd and pervert justice. On the other hand, nor should you take sides with a poor man in his case. If you find your enemy's ox or his donkey going astray, you must surely bring it back to him again. If you see the donkey of the one who hates you lying down under its burden, do not leave it. Rather, you are to release it with him. You are not to pervert justice to your poor in his dispute. Stay far away from a false charge. Do not kill the innocent and the righteous, for I will not justify the guilty. Take no bribe, for a bribe blinds those who have sight and perverts the words of the righteous. Do not oppress an outsider, for you know the heart of an outsider, since you were outsiders in the land of Egypt. For 6 years you are to sow your land and gather the increase. But during the 7th year you are to let it rest and lie fallow, so that the poor among your people may eat. Whatever they leave behind, the animals of the field may eat. You are to deal with your vineyard and your olive grove in the same way. You are to do your work for 6 days, but on the 7th day you will rest, so that your ox and your donkey may have rest, and also the son of your handmaid and the outsider may be refreshed. With all the things that I have said to you, take heed. Make no mention of the names of other gods, and do not let them be heard in your mouth. 3 times in the year you are to celebrate a festival for me. You are to observe the festival of Matzot. For 7 days you will eat matzah as I commanded you, at the time appointed in the month of Aviv, for that is when you came out from Egypt. No one is to appear before me empty-handed. Also you are to observe the feast of harvest, the first fruits of your labours that you sow in the field, as well as the feast of the ingathering at the end of the year, when you gather your crops from the field. 3 times in the year all your men are to appear before Adonai Elohim. Do not offer the blood of my sacrifice with hametz, nor is the fat of my feast to remain out all night until the morning. Bring the choicest first fruits of your land into the house of Adonai your God. Do not boil a kid in its mother's milk. Behold, I am sending an angel before you to guard you on the way and to bring you into the place that I have prepared. Watch for him and listen to his voice. Do not rebel against him, because he will not pardon your transgression, for my name is in him. But if you listen closely to his voice and do everything I say, I will be an enemy to your enemies and an adversary to your adversaries. For my angel will go before you and bring you to the Amorites, Hittites, Perizzites, Canaanites, Hivites, and the Jebusites, and I will cut them off. You are not to bow down to their gods or serve them, or do what they do. Rather, you are to utterly overthrow them and break their pillars in pieces. You are to serve Adonai your God, and he will bless your food and your water. Moreover, I will take sickness away from your midst. None will miscarry nor be barren in your land, and I will fill up the number of your days. I will send my terror before you and throw all the people to whom you will come into panic, and make all your enemies turn their backs to you. I will send the hornet before you, which will drive out the Hivites, the Canaanites, and the Hittites from before you. I will not drive them out from before you in a single year, otherwise the land will become desolate and the animals of the field will multiply against you. But little by little I will drive them out from before you until you are fruitful. Then you will possess the land. I will set your border from the Sea of Reeds to the Sea of the Philistines, and from the wilderness to the Euphrates River. For I will deliver the inhabitants of the land into your hand, and you are to drive them out before you. Make no covenant with them or with their gods. They must not dwell in your land and cause you to sin against me. Or if you worship their gods, they will be a snare to you.
Then to Moses he said, Come up to Adonai, you and Aaron, Nadab and Abihu, and the 70 elders of Israel, and worship from afar. Moses alone is to approach Adonai, but the others may not draw near, nor are the people to go up with him. So Moses came and told the people all the word of Adonai, as well as all the ordinance. All the people answered with one voice and said, All the words of Adonai has spoken, we will do. So Moses wrote down all the words of Adonai, then rose up early in the morning and built an altar below the mountain. Along with 12 pillars for the 12 tribes of Israel, he then sent out the young men of Bnei Israel who sacrificed burnt offering and fellowship offering of oxen to Adonai. Then Moses took half of the blood and put it in basins, and the other half he poured out against the altar. He took the scroll of the covenant and read it in the hearing of the people. Again they said, All that Adonai has spoken, we will do and obey. Then Moses took the blood, sprinkled it on the people, and said, Behold the blood of the covenant, which Adonai has cut with you in agreement with all these words. Then Moses and Aaron, Nadab and Abihu, and 70 of the elders of Israel went up. They saw the God of Israel, and under his feet was something like a pavement of sapphire, as clear as the very heavens. Yet he did not raise his hand against the nobles of Bnei Israel. So they beheld God and ate and drank. Then Adonai said to Moses, Come up to me on the mountain and stay there, and I will give you the tablets of stone with the Torah and the mitzvah, which I have written, so that you may instruct them. So Moses rose up along with his attendant Joshua, and Moses went up onto the mountain of God. To the elder I said, Wait for us here until we come back to you. See, Aaron and Hur are with you. Whoever has a dispute should go to them. When Moses went up on the mountain, the cloud covered it. The glory of Adonai settled upon Mount Sinai, and the cloud covered it for 6 days. Then, on the 7th day, he called to Moses out of the midst of the cloud. The appearance of the glory of Adonai was like a consuming fire on the top of the mountain in the sight of Bnei Israel. So Moses entered into the midst of the cloud and went up into the mountain. Moses was on the mountain 40 days and 40 nights.
That's great.
The word that came to Jeremiah from Adonai after King Zedekiah had made a covenant with all the people that were at Jerusalem to proclaim liberty to them, so that everyone should let his manservant and his maidservant, Hebrew man or Hebrew woman, go free, so that no one should make a slave of a Jew, his brother. So all the princes and all the people obeyed who had entered into the covenant, that everyone would free his manservant and his maidservant and not make them slaves anymore. They obeyed and freed them. But afterward they turned around and made the servants and the handmaids who they had let go free return and brought them back into subjection as servants and as handmaids. So the word of Adonai came to Jeremiah from Adonai, saying, Thus says Adonai, the God of Israel, I made a covenant with your fathers in the day that I brought them out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage, saying, At the end of 7 years you are to set free every man his brother, that is a Hebrew who has been sold to you, and has served you 6 years. You are letting him go free from you. But your fathers did not obey me, nor inclined their ear. Now you had repented and had done that which is right in my eyes, by proclaiming liberty, everyone to his neighbor. You even had made a covenant before me in the house where my name is called. But you turned around and profaned my name, and made everyone his servant and his handmaid, whom you have let go free at their will, returned, and you brought them back into subjection, to be your servants and handmaids. Therefore, thus says Adonai, you have not obeyed me to proclaim liberty, everyone to his brother and everyone to his neighbor. Behold, I proclaim for you a liberty, declares Adonai, to the sword, to plague, and to famine. So I will make you a horror to all the kingdoms of the earth. I will give them men who have transgressed my covenant, who have not performed the words of the covenant which they made before me, when they cut the calf in two and passed between its parts. The princes of Judah and the princes of Jerusalem, the officers, the Kohanim, and all the people of the land who passed between the parts of the calf, I will even give them into the hand of their enemies, and into the hand of them who seek their life, and their dead bodies will be for food to the birds of the sky and to the beasts of the earth. King Zedekiah of Judah and his princes I will give into the hand of their enemies, and into the hand of them who seek their life, and into the hand of the king of Babylon's army, who are withdrawing from you. Indeed, I will command, declares Adonai, and cause them to return to this city. They will fight against it, capture it, burn it down with fire, and I will make the cities of Judah a wasteland with no one living.
Shabbat Shalom. A really great day, because we're all alive, we're still here. God's gracious to us. Every day I wake up and say, well, I've got another day, Lord, what do I do today? Anyway, we're reading out of Matthew. You have heard that our fathers were told, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. But I tell you, not to stand up against someone who does you wrong. That's hard. On the contrary, if someone hits you on the right cheek, don't hit them back. Let them hit you on the left cheek too. That's a bit hard, eh? If someone wants to sue you for your shirt, let them have your coat as well. I don't know about that anyway, so it doesn't matter. If a soldier forces you to carry his pack for 1 mile, carry it for 2. When someone asks you for something, give it to him. When someone wants you to borrow something from you, lend it to him. You have heard that our fathers were told, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you. Then you will become children of your Father in heaven. For he makes the sun shine on good and bad people alike, and he sends rain on the righteous and on the unrighteous alike. What reward do you get if you love only those who love you? Why, even tax collectors do that. And if you are friendly only to your friends, are you doing anything out of the ordinary? Even the Goyim do that. Therefore be perfect, just as your Father in heaven is perfect. That's not an option. Not an option. Luke 17, verse 1. Yeshua said to Talmud, it is impossible that snares will not be set, but woe to the person who sets them. Would it be to his advantage that you have a millstone hung around your neck and be thrown into the sea, rather than that you ensnare one of these little ones? So watch yourself. If your brother sins, rebuke him. If he repents, forgive him. Also, if 7 times in one day he sins against you, and 7 times he comes to you and says, I repent, you are to forgive him. The emissary said to the Lord, Increase our trust. The Lord replied, if you had trust as tiny as a mustard seed, you could say to this fig tree, be uprooted and replanted in the sea, and it would obey you. If one of you has a slave tending to sheep or plowing, when he comes back from the field, will you say to him, come along, sit down and eat? No, you'll say, get my supper ready, dress for work, and serve me until I have finished eating and drinking, and after that you may eat and drink. Does he thank the slave because he did what he was told to do? No, it is the same with you. When you have done everything you were told to do, you should be saying, we're just ordinary slaves. We have only done our duty.
Sorry about that.
Then the Pharisees and some of the scribes came together to him, having come from Jerusalem. Now when they saw some of his disciples eat bread with defiled, that is, with unwashed hands, they found fault. For the Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they wash their hands in a special way, holding the tradition of the elders. When they come from the marketplace, they do not eat unless they wash, and there are many other things which they have received and hold, like the washing of cups, pitchers, copper vessels, and cultures. Then the Pharisees and the scribes asked him, why do your disciples not walk according to the tradition of the elders, but eat bread with unwashed hands? He answered and he said to them, well did Isaiah prophesy of you hypocrites, as it is written, this people honours me with their lips, but their heart is far from me, and in vain they worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men. For laying aside the commandment of God, you hold the tradition of men, the washing of pitchers and cups, and many other such things you do. He said to them, all too well you reject the commandment of God, that you may keep your tradition. For Moses said, honour your father and your mother, and he who kills his father or mother, let him be put to death. But you say, if a man says to his father or mother, whatever profit you might have received from me is Corban, that is a gift of God. Then you no longer let him do anything for his father or his mother, making the word of God to no effect through your tradition, which you have handed down, and many such things you do. When he had called all the multitude to himself, he said to them, hear me, everyone, and understand. There is nothing that enters a man from outside which can defile him, but the things which come out of him, those are the things that defile a man. If anyone hears ears to hear, let him hear.
Shayu looked straight at them and said, Shayu is Saul, Paul, the same person. So, brothers,
I have been discharging my obligation to God with a perfectly clear conscience, right up until today. But the Kohen Hagadol, Hanaya, Kohen Hagadol, Hanaya, it means the high priest Ananias, ordered those standing near him to strike him on the mouth. Then Saul, that's Saul, said to him, God will strike you, you whitewashed wall. Will you sit there judging me according to the Torah? Torah, it means God's word. Yet in violation of Torah, order me to be struck. The man nearby said, This is the Kohen Hagadol of God that you are insulting. Shaul said, I didn't know, brothers, that he was Kohen Hagadol. For it says in the Torah, you are not to speak disparagingly of a ruler of your people. But knowing that one part of the Sanhedrin consists of Zaddukim, it means Sadducee, and the other of Perishim is Pharisees. Shaul shouted, Brothers, I myself am Parush, and the son of Parushim. Shaul means a Pharisee, and Parushim is Pharisees. And it is concerning the hope of the resurrection of the dead that I'm being tried. When he said this, an argument arose between the Parishim and the Zaddukim, and the crowd was divided. For the Zaddukim denied the resurrection and the existence of angels and spirits, whereas the Parishim acknowledged both. So there was a great uproar, with some of the Torah teachers, means law teachers, who were on the side of Parishim, Pharisees, standing up and joining in. We don't find anything wrong with this man, and if a spirit or an angel spoke to him, what of it? The dispute became so violent that the commander, fearing that Shaul would be torn apart by them, ordered the soldiers to go down, take him by force, and bring him back into the barracks. The following night, the Lord stood by him and said, Take courage, for just as you have borne a faithful witness to me in Jerusalem means Jerusalem, so now you must bear witness in Rome. The next day, some of the Judeans formed a conspiracy. They took an oath, saying they would neither eat nor drink until they had killed Shaul. More than 40 were involved in this plot. They went to the head Kohenian. Kohenian means priest, and the elders, and said, We have bound ourselves by an oath to taste no food until we have killed Shaul. What you to do is make it appear to the commander that you and Sanhedrin wants to get more accurate information about Shaul's case, so that he will bring him down to you, while we, for our parts, are prepared to kill him before he ever gets here.
It's reading I read at the beginning, which is about Yeshua, chapter 2, who, though existing in the form of God, did not equate himself with his Father. But actually, it provided a really good introduction to the aspects of when they're on Mount Sinai. I'll get back to that in a minute. So I trust everyone is well today. I'm just thinking of Sean, he's actually down and I'm actually getting another headset unit which actually won't kick in and out. So that'll make it a bit easier. Just waiting for it to arrive. Sean's actually ministering down in Gisborne. And so just keep him in your thoughts and prayers. And to congregation down there, he's to the men first. And then on tomorrow, we'll be talking to the congregation now. I'm sure they'll love to hear what he has to say, which is good. I don't know if anyone knows Guthrie Boyd. He's the leader of the congregation down there. Man, this flicks in and out, doesn't it? I'll stand over here on the side. The work flicking in and out. That's good. Now, last week, Parashah Yitro, Adonai prioritized family thing, the importance of family. And family is very important, being near the top of the importance chart. And for leaders, they must have their house in order as an example to his people. It was also essential to be open to and recognize good sound advice. Are you open to good sound advice? Does say don't be swayed by every doctrine and wind that's floating around, but be open to good advice. So stick to one or two folk that you have a confidence in, and pray with you, and hear their advice. Recognize the Holy Spirit in each one. Often they can be very close to you. And the key is to make sure that they're nice and straight with you and honest, rather than just yes people. Be humble enough to see it just like Moshe did. Now listen for the Ruach HaKodesh, his confirmation and his guidance. He met with his people and spoke out the Aseret, the Devarim, the 10 words and the commands, so that they would rightly represent him as his chosen people and the priesthood. That's what it's given for, because it was important that they were actually to be established as a people that would walk rightly and openly, honestly before him. Well, they certainly have a checkered record from then right through to now. But still, that doesn't change the things. It's because God is faithful and he's strong. And he confirms with his covenants, but he will have got very frustrated over all those millennia. Equally, with believers today, and for the last 2,000 years. And it was almost like, wasn't a lot of difference. Yeshua died. He went to his Father. And then there was chaos. And there's been chaos ever since. So there hasn't been a lot of difference, which is an interesting one. God was saying, remember when he said to Moshe, look, I'll just get rid of the whole lot and start again. 2,000 years later, after that, he probably wanted the same. 4,000 years later, he's probably still wanting the same. But he has put his trust that people will eventually change as we heed him and honour his ways. So if you're getting frustrated, just relax, because it's no different. God's frustration must be a hang of a lot more than that. So we've got nothing to be concerned about in comparison, but rather to trust him, because he will come through. In Brit Hadashah, the New Covenant declares that all believers in Yeshua as sons and daughters of the King of Kings and Lord of Lords actually became king. Actually, I missed the first part. It was talking about chosen people. They were set up to be a chosen people and a priesthood, a kingdom of priests. That's what it said they were supposed to be. Likewise, us as believers in Yeshua, as sons and daughters of the King of Kings and Lord of Lords, become priests unto Adonai. And the tablets with the 10 words, the Torah, the mitzvah, the teachings and the commands which were placed inside the ark, and while the statutes and the ordinances that were written on the scroll were actually placed outside the ark. We understood the ramifications of that. For Ezekiel and Jeremiah, they confirmed that the new covenant, for which Israel, was those which were to be written on the heart. So as a result, Yeshua summed up these 10 mitzvot, indeed the entire Torah, with these words from the Shema. Love Adonai, your Elohim, with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, and with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. And he gave his disciples a further 10 words, the Beatitudes which flow out of the 10 words. And these all are to be written on your heart, new way of living. That's what the whole emphasis is about, that his ways are written on our heart. Many of the other things help and guide and lead to ways of living and standards, but they're not to be, you don't need for them to be written on your heart. They flow out of what's written on our heart. This week's parasha, Mitzvatim, the rulings, or the ordinances, instructions, judgments. They actually cover many important instructions which are given by Yahweh to formalize a new way of living, or returning to a code which he always intended for people to live. A guide for the daily lives of his holy nation, to be a people after his own heart, showing love, justice, and righteousness, firstly to his own people, and then an example for the world to follow. These rulings provided the ultimate foundation for living as God's people, a way of life that glorified God and made him known to all nations, a way of life separate from all other peoples, a way of life that ensures a viable, safe society, a way of life we will not know fully until Yeshua returns. These commandments, they actually deal with our relationship with God and our relationship with each other. The Mishpatim clearly show that God wants to be involved in our relationships. Parashah Mishpatim actually contains 53 mitzvot of 23 do's and 23 don'ts. And this series of instructions are also called the Covenant Code. In many of the Western countries, actually, the status, their statutes and their regulations are actually based on the ordinances defined in the Torah and originally included in many of the associated punishments. But everything's been changed and watered down, and now, yeah, just about anything goes. The presentation of Jewish civil law, which pertains to personal damage, lending, manslaughter, kidnapping, actually begins with the laws concerning slavery. It's interesting that the instructions commence with how to treat Hebrew servants, followed by family and neighbourly matters. God's all about relationships and freedom and loving one's neighbour as oneself. And so wants the focus of his family, the Israelites, that they had just been released from slavery to learn from the experience. And, as an aside, to the reference to releasing of a servant after 6 years, and made free in the 7th year, the 6 years represent the 6,000 years that we work to serve Adonai. The 7th year of freedom represents the Messianic age. The 1,000 years when we will rule and reign from Jerusalem with Messiah. God perhaps begins with slavery, because slavery had been Israel's primary national experience. Many of the ordinances, they're kind of all over the place. But they actually came and gave rise by things that happened in their generations. The things that actually happened in their experience as a nation, as a people. And as things rose and came to rise. And interestingly, when you look at it, and even the Brit Hadashah, some of the things are kind of a bit all over the place. And someone's wondering, why is there no absolute sequence in these things? It's because they've been given rise to occasions, issues that have arisen, and they're a response. And same with, especially with Shaul's writings, the same thing, his letters to the various congregations actually arose entirely out of issues that arose. And he was responding to them on how to deal with the issues. The experience of the slavery was etched into the very fabric of their being, as we mentioned last week, that we need to get Egypt's ways out of our system. And although slavery and forced servitude is repulsive to most of us today, at that time it was a widely accepted practice, and God desired to place in its proper perspective. In that day, slavery would have been beneficial or harmful, depending upon the nation where it was instituted, and the character of the slave owner. Indeed, a slave owner who followed the Torah would be much more considerate of the welfare of the slaves than many employers who dishonor and disrespect employees. And we can actually tie in that today, the landlords that want to honor the people that they rent their houses to, versus those that just want to make the most out of people and have actually purchased the places and properties for just their own personal gain. rather than for the interest of the people they're supposed to be housing. So that's a modern take on it. And most of them should actually get their head around it and realise that actually God actually looks at those things and will deal with them accordingly. This ordinance was also for the Hebrew indentured servant who is working off a debt. Also applies to those who fell into poverty, could not pay their creditors. Therefore, God instituted rules of social justice over slavery that protected human dignity and individual rights. Apostle Shaul spoke choice of paper versus computer. About this in Ephesians 6, Shaul spoke about Ephesians 6, 5 to 9. He said, slaves, obey your masters and with respect and reverence. We covered it through there. In the end, it says, the masters, treat your slaves in the same way of respecting them unto the Lord. Stop using threats, knowing that the master of you and of you too is in heaven, and there's no favoritism with him. It's actually interesting that Rav Shaul's letter to Philemon is actually included in the scriptures. It's actually specifically and only addresses the issue of treating the slave Onesimus, the fellow believer in Yeshua who had run away. And as a brother rather than a slave, I imagine Rav Shaul, as a Pharisee, clearly noted the importance of this issue to God, as it was the first ordinance that was actually mentioned. And that's kind of why it got included, the importance, because the first issue that was mentioned was to do with how to deal with slaves. And so Shaul has included this to show the importance of that first ordinance. As a reminder that all Hebrews in Egypt were slaves, and God set them free. Hence, it was a constant reminder of God's grace and His mercy, and that we too need to show that mercy and that grace. The Haftarah Mishpatim emphasizes the seriousness with which God regards the limits of slavery outlined in the Torah portion, as well as his compassion for a slave. When the Babylonians inherited Jerusalem, the Israelite slave owners made a pact with King Zedekiah, agreeing to release their Jewish slaves. And 1 year later, however, when the Babylonians retreated, the slave owners, feeling now free and secure, what did they do? They set about forcibly re-enslaving those who had already been set free. It was Jeremiah 35. So God hated it. He says, hang about. There's no regard. A word had to be a word. The bond was the bond. And that's the thing today as well. If we say we're going to do something, we say we're committed to it, whether it costs you or not, you've got to actually just stick with it. It's important because God sees that. It's what's written on your heart. He sees what your heart is about. And that's more important than just things we actually say. We have to follow up and back up what we say with the way we live and the way we treat people. The ordinances were intended to create a profound respect for every human being. And that's really one of the fundamentals of it, is that each one must be treated correctly and well. If you go through a lot of the statutes, when you're running through it, they're almost common sense from a modern day perspective when you're looking back, because we've increasingly been encouraged or taught that, you've got to respect and look after people. That wasn't a natural thing, really, up until probably the 30s, even the 20s, really, 1920s. Prior to that, it was kind of, very much, if it's in my interest, it's all good. It's not about those that need to be cared for and looked after. So it's interesting how things have actually developed and changed through time. But for many centuries, most people were if you didn't own things, if you weren't in charge, then everyone else was just rubbish. And you were just a thing, entirely forgotten. It's almost like for a period of 2,000 years, almost, minus 100 years or so. It was actually, they'd forgotten what the principles, even what Yeshua was talking about. Respect, care, look after one another, treat each other well. It's just kind of almost a whole period of that time evaporated. And the way people treated each other was just terrible, wasn't it? When you look at history, the history of the last 2,000 years, the way people just no regard for life. It's, well, and it was all laid out. But the ordinances given, as I mentioned, create a profound respect for each human being. It's told that in the 13th century, one of the sages was challenged to sum up the entire Torah while standing on one leg. He said, and you shall love the neighbor as yourself. Ve'ahavta recha kamocha. This also echoes what Shaul said. For the whole law can be summed up in this command. Love your neighbor as yourself. In Galatians 5. It's always been there. Those scriptures have always been there, but it's kind of, wow. It's almost, like I say, 2,000 years since Yeshua. It's almost just evaporated. No wonder they had the things called the Dark Ages. I mean, they were dark. They were terribly dark. And you wonder, God allowed that to happen. All that period, isn't it? It's like they kind of cursed themselves for all that entire period. And Yeshua responded to a similar challenge in like manner. So one of the teachers of the law, the Pharisees, came to him and said, I heard them. And Yeshua and the Sadducees are debating. Noticing that Yeshua had given them a good answer, he said, of all the commandments, which is the most important? The most important one, answered Yeshua. Shema Israel Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. Hear, Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. And love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength. And the second is this: Love your neighbor as yourself. There is no commandment greater than these. Yeshua emphasized that our primary service in this life is to love God and to love our neighbor and to love each other. And it says if we don't love each other, you can't love God. That's what spells it out, isn't it? As we've indicated many times previously, Yeshua stated in Matthew 5, verse 17, he did not come to abolish the Torah, but to fulfill and complete it. He came to show us that the Torah is what it's all about. And he talked about it in the scriptures when it says, you've just made up your own. You've added to these things. You know, we're going to be washing this and washing that, and washing hands and washing things, rather than actually concentrating on the tenets I've actually given you. Look after each other, care for each other. Especially look after your parents. You know, it's the 10 part of the 10 words. 10 words, it's all spelled out there. That's what needs to be written on our hearts. And we'll understand clearly what our requirement is. We could try so hard to keep all the ordinances to the letter and totally miss the spirit of Torah if we're doing it without love. The Apostle Shaul went as far as to say that if we do not love, we are nothing. 1 Corinthians. This week's Torah portion, it contains a lot of statutes, a lot of ordinances. Read like, and Exodus 21, 20 to 23 actually reads, the chapters actually read like an ancient legal code. Most in Christendom view the laws of Torah as the opposite of grace. When trying to discuss these issues, you might hear it said, we're no longer under the law, we're under grace. The implication is that since we've received the Messiah, we need not concern ourselves with the Torah in the Hebrew scriptures. We can call this idea grace versus law. Now, just thinking about that, though, that what do we mean when we say that we're not under law? Does it mean that we do not keep God's rules? Do we just do what we want? It's called anarchy. For example, does it mean that we can commit adultery? That we can steal? That we can thieve? That we can desire or want what we don't have, someone else's? No. So what does it mean? The grace versus law concept is derived from the writings of Rabbi Shaul. But I say derived, without understanding it from the Jewish perspective. In his epistles, it seems that Rabbi Shaul puts the two in opposition to each other. He says things like, before faith came, we were kept in custody under the law. Galatians 3:23. And if we are led by the Spirit, we are not under the law. Galatians 5, verse 18. One might misunderstand these statements to mean that the believers do not need to keep God's rules. And if we don't, He will automatically cover it and dismiss it by His grace. Well, of course, that's, according to the scriptures, is absurd. Shaul actually realized that some people might misunderstand this teaching. And as he cautioned us not to suppose that grace gives us free license to sin against God. What shall we say then? Are we to continue in sin so that grace may increase? May it never be. How shall we who died to sin still live in it? Romans 6 verse 12, 1 to 2. Do we then nullify the law through faith? May it never be. On the contrary, we establish the law. That's Romans 3 verse 31. If Shaul was not teaching believers that they did not have to keep God's rules, what was he talking about? In Shaul's day, many of the Jewish believers taught that before Gentiles could be part of the kingdom of heaven, they needed to become Jewish. The idea that a Gentile must become a Jew before being saved is what Shaul calls being under the law. He believes that that Gentiles became sons of Abraham and part of the people of God through faith in the Messiah. They did not need to earn that status by becoming legally Jewish. They did not need to first come under the law in order to enter the kingdom. That's why Jerusalem Council concurred and simplified the requirements for Gentiles to follow. One would be forgiven for at times thinking that Yeshua was changing some of the original ordinances. Remember the well-known ordinance found in Torah, which at times is also mentioned by many non-believers? An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. That's in Exodus 21. This verse expresses the point that in the execution of justice, the punishment should fit the crime. Punishments were to be neither too harsh nor too lenient. In other cultures of the day had punishments totally disproportionate to the crime and totally out of keeping with what was intended. And Yeshua shed light on this passage in such a way that showed it was not to be used as a grounds for personal revenge and retribution on our enemies. In fact, he said, you have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist an evil person, but whoever slaps you on the right cheek, turn the other towards him also. Love your enemies, bless those who curse you, do good to those who hate you, and pray for those who spitefully use you and persecute you, that you may be sons of the Father in heaven. Yeshua wasn't changing the Torah as he was involved in giving the Mishpatim. He was actually raising the bar from a minimum standard of what was just acceptable up to an alignment which is actually expected of a holy, righteous people. If the Shema is written on your heart, then you will want to do far more than what's the minimum. You will want to radiate his light, and our conduct and our motives will reflect it. Unfortunately, the Pharisees and many others just didn't quite get it. That's what he was talking about. It was actually is the expectation that of his people was the same. He said, you right through the scripture, it talks about, you want one of the things on the heart, not being stuck with always looking and measuring, saying, oh, now if I do this, I'll just get away with it. If I do this, this is all I need to do. That was not the intent at all. It was all about loving God, seeing the people in the world, seeing people around us from his perspective. How are we going to treat them? How are we going to deal with them? He wants all people to look that way. And then we can actually be seen as a holy people. That's what he expects of the holy people. Those will actually see people from his way his perspective. Treat people accordingly, both in the natural, the spiritual, and the physical. Walking with God is not about the rule keeping, even though God does have clear guidelines by which we need to actually live once we've accepted Yeshua as our Lord, as our Savior. It's about knowing Him, really knowing Him, knowing what He actually wants, knowing actually what He expects. We can't just carry on just doing our own thing and think that He's going to just turn a blind eye. We're only fooling ourselves, unfortunately. The prophet Jeremiah foretold a new covenant where all will know God, from the least to the greatest, whether male or female, Jew or Gentile, young or old, through the Brit Hadashah, which was sealed in the blood of Yeshua. We can all have free access to God. Moshe ratified the original covenants, ordinances, by sprinkling blood on the two contractual parties, half on the people of Israel and half on the altar, which represented God. And all the covenants were sealed in the blood. And hence likewise, when Yeshua shed his blood on the execution stake, he entered the most holy place. And he gave his own precious blood. And that poured out on both mankind and the earth. And it was a covenant between man and God. And when he died, the veil separated the people from the most holy place. It was torn top to bottom. As a result, however, we can now freely and boldly go to the throne of God, all by ourselves, to find help and grace, his grace, in the time of need. In the last part of today's parasha, we get a hint that God, desiring to be close to man and to walk and talk with them, as in the Garden of Eden, he got them to come up the mount to actually visit with him. It's basically like a foretaste, again, of renewed relationship. It's all about relationship with God. And to show different aspects of God, and that God was preparing them again for what they could look forward to when the Messiah would actually come and live and walk amongst them on earth. There's no doubt that God actually allowing these humans to see his feet was an extraordinary privilege. Recall the statement of John the Baptist. He says, whose shoes I'm not worthy to bear. The word shoes actually are very significant. There's a different understanding from what we often understand. It's actually about they'd actually put just a separation on their feet to separate their feet from the earth. But the nature of the type of sandals they actually wore. The people then actually took these off when they went into the house. It was interesting to unloose and bind on sandals. These days, it's pretty easy to put them on, take them off. But those days, it wasn't quite so simple. They often required the lowliest of servants to actually help them. The expression of this in this place, therefore, denotes great humility. John says that he was not worthy as a servant of him who would come after him. That the 74 chosen individuals actually saw only the feet of God reinforces the idea that we are certainly not equals In his unmerited kindness, he allows these men to actually see his feet, to reinforce the fact of his presence. This passage actually references Yeshua, one like the Son of Man, God manifested as the Messiah ben David. It talks about his feet. That's the wonderful thing that we can actually see, God in human form. Often I wonder if believers today think that God of the original covenants is retired or dead, replaced by Yeshua, a more compassionate and loving Son of God, a different kind of ruler, a different ruler. This is followed by the concepts that Yeshua changed changed mid-Bible from grace and justice to grace only, totally abrogating God's commands, rulings, and statutes. There's no regard for understanding the fact that God doesn't change. He's the same today, as forever. Regardless of what these individuals perceived, they must have been totally awestruck. You know, the ones that went up the mountain. Although we have yet to have the privilege of physically seeing Yahweh Elohim, who intercedes on our behalf to Elohim, most of us have never seen him, unless you're 2,000 years old. You might have seen him in a dream. But I'm sure you're looking forward to actually seeing him when he actually does come. One day, if we persevere and win the race, we will see God and dwell together with him. We can know and experience the awe, the fear, and the love of God each time that we enter his courts with praise, supplication, thanksgiving, meditation, or when we study as the Ruach HaKodesh is always with us. The very fact that we are allowed such a privilege should cause us to humble ourselves as we spiritually bow at God's feet and prostrate ourselves before his throne. We do this in readiness for his return. We need to ensure that we're ready and waiting as part of his body of believers. We need to show evidence that we continue to be holy, as was expressed in the last parashah. Yeshua reiterated that it's not what goes in that makes us unholy, rather what comes out. Hebrews 10 verse 22. So let us draw near with a true heart, being constantly renewed into his likeness. May that be. Make sure we've got the things written on our hearts, because he is coming and he's looking for you and me to be holy and right before him. Shabbat shalom. If anyone wants to have a look at a list of 613 mitzvot, you probably wondered what they all were. There's quite a few.
Yevarekeka Adonai Beresh Mereka. Yair Adonai Panav Alecha. Bekuneka. Yiseh Adonai Panav Alecha. Yasim Lecha Shalom. Adonai bless you and keep you. Adonai make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. Adonai turn his face towards you and grant you shalom. Have a wonderful week, family. Blessings.